America, from the ground up, is made possible in part by a grant from the Michigan Humanities Council, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Central Michigan University College of Humanities, Social, and Behavioral Sciences. The Kirby Foundation, a family foundation supporting education. And B.K. Bradshaw, author of the Crystal Brave series of young adult novels, encouraging young people to explore archaeology.
The earliest evidence we have for the people who first settled North America more than 10,000 years ago are stone tools. You might think that stone tools are just rocks. And what are rocks going to tell us about how people lived, what they ate, or what they believed? Quite a lot, actually. It all depends on what questions you ask them.
And in this episode, we explore the ways that archaeologists are using STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, to learn about how people lived in the past. We'll revisit some of the exciting excavations from this series and visit a few new ones, as well as we investigate the science of archaeology. The first question is, what was America like when the first humans came to the continent? I traveled to southwest Missouri to meet up with Matt Foyer from the Missouri Institute of Natural Science to find out. Matt and his team have been excavating a cave that holds fascinating clues to America's past.
The first thing we need to do is figure out what animals are living in North America when the ancestors first arrive. And one of the best places to do that is right here in southwest Missouri in River Bluff Cave. In terms of the types of animals that are going to be in North America when we have humans first coming into the continent, what's in the cave that's representative of that?
When they first got in this area, humans at least, when they first got here, you had mammoths, mastodons, the elk, bison, a lot of stuff that you would see today, the elk and deer. And then you had dire wolves, the large cats like American lion, which we have here in the cave, saber-toothed cats, and the giant short-faced bear. Arctodus simus, the largest predator on the land during the Ice Age, 2.2 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, and people encountered these guys when they came across the Bering Land Bridge.
Wow, fantastic. How big is this guy going to be?
This is a 2,000-pound on average bear. The dimensions of this animal on all fours, it's 10 feet in length, 6 feet tall at the shoulder, and can run about 40 miles an hour in a straight line. Bite force potential between this, because if you check out this big crest back here, it's all muscle attachment here, going in the lower jaw, that masseter muscle that you can feel inside of your head. Ours is tiny, this one's the size of your thigh. And this is what crushes down. It's 2,000 to 3,000 pounds per square inch of crushing force between the teeth.
Wow. So you definitely don't want to have to run into this guy.
Oh, exactly. And these guys lived in the caves, and we have lots of evidence. They're in this cave here, reaching upwards of 16, 18 feet up on the walls, making their claw marks. They're denning in here during the wintertime, raising their young, in case of River Bluff Cave here. And these guys are using caves, and that's what's keeping humans from utilizing cave entrances when they first got into America. After these guys died out about 10,000 years ago, after that, even there's a little lag time after that, they still weren't using the caves because they were afraid of these guys right here.
You don't want this guy for your neighbor.
No, you don't. No.
At Angel Mounds in Indiana, I met with Jeremy Wilson to talk about how his team is using some of the most advanced scientific technology to peer beneath the Earth's surface.
My co-investigator, Bill Monahan in particular, who's a geologist by training, has cored through Mound A here and learned that deposits from both the base and the top of the mound are radiometrically indistinguishable. So what that means is we've done radiocarbon dating from both the top and the bottom, and those dates come out to roughly AD 1100.
So it's being built pretty much at the same time.
Yeah, my co-PI estimates that the mound was constructed in about 10 years' time.
Wow, that's a huge undertaking.
I asked Jeremy to tell me more about the process.
This is called a continuous core system. So as you can see, we are in the process of driving down the cores through the top of the mound. The mound is about 2.5 meters in height, and the cores are extracted in 4-foot lengths.
So they drive it down and then pull that clear plastic tube up out of the ground, and that's going to have the soil sample in it.
Correct, yeah, and it'll have, as you can see in the background, the entire core is sheathed to ensure the recovery of the sediments or the strata all the way down to the base of the mound.
And then we take that back to the lab, slice it open, and analyze the core.
Yeah.
Archaeologists at Angel Mounds are also using remote sensing equipment to scan below the ground.
So Jeremy, what is it that Matt's doing here in the field behind us?
We are doing a specific type of remote sensing known as magnetometry. So Matt is walking back and forth on what we call transects, which are straight lines, and as he is walking, the magnetometer is picking up subsurface readings of positive or negative charges in the ground.
So it's like bouncing a signal down and then measuring the sort of rebound, if you will.
Exactly. It's basically measuring things that are emitting some type of polarity beneath the ground surface.
Matt and I went over the amazing results of the scans.
So Matt, here in the center, we've got a rectilinear, or in sort of plain English, a rectangle-shaped structure. What could that be?
Well, since we haven't yet ground truthed it, we will just call it a magnetic anomaly, but nature doesn't make straight lines. So when you see straight lines like this in the ground, you know, that's usually something that people have constructed. Right. And the size of this is probably almost 30 meters on a side. So that's a very good possibility that that is a structure either on the mound or possibly under the mound, and that the mound itself was a capping event on top of a structure that was on the original ground.
So they might have built up over top of it at a later date. Okay.
So what you're seeing there is probably a result of the construction method that we see here at Angel, which is wall trenching, where an entire trench is dug out, posts are put into it, and then soil is backfilled into that.
Right.
So depending on the soil that goes back into it, you get either a high or a low in the magnetic reading.
Yeah, and what you see then in the reading is these really nice, well-defined trench lines, if that's what it proves to be when we excavate.
When it all works out how it should, you get a real pretty picture.
This really represents a new era in archaeology where we can do either non or minimally invasive techniques to explore archaeological sites.
Experience and their own two hands are the most advanced tools in an archaeologist's toolkit. But it's not about digging for treasure. We're digging so we can learn about the past.
Well, one of the things that people really want to know is how we know what to keep and what we just throw away. And the simple answer is we keep anything that's not a rock or a root. We're interested in saving the things that were left by humans, the bones from the animals that they were eating, or that were made by humans. A bead, a piece of a dish, a piece of window pane glass. So we save the pieces of the building, the things that people used.
So then, when archaeologists talk about excavation, what do we mean?
Basically, it's controlled digging, and by controlled, the first thing we have to do is know where we are in space, and so we establish a grid. You can see our bright pink strings here. We do hand excavation here, so we use mason's trowels.
We are finishing up the base of our level 2. So that is there's the sod level, which is where we remove all of the sod. And then there's levels 1 through however deep you have to go. And each level, the way we're doing it, is 10 centimeters down.
So what is it that Hillary's doing here at the screening table?
Well, this is the next step. Once we have our bucket of dirt, we bring it over, and first we run it through a 1/4-inch screen, and this helps us get the larger rocks out. Pieces of chinking from between the posts we'll save that are found here. And then we put the dirt on the window screen. We've sifted it right onto the window screen. We use water from the hoses to force it through, and then we pick through the tiny little remains. And so if you look here, what she's picking out are fish bones mostly, fish scales. Sometimes we find little glass beads, the tiniest little seed beads. We find lead shot. We've been finding pieces of straight pin.
Modern archaeology is more than just digging a hole in the ground. And science is helping us to preserve the important pieces of our past, including Fort Edward and Rogers Island. Chris Sabick from the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum told me how he's working to preserve timbers recovered from the Fort Edward site.
Chris, we're out here in the glamorous shed facility at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, but in reality, this is an incredibly sophisticated operation, and you guys have one of the largest wood preservation tanks, if not in the United States, certainly in the region.
That's true. We have this large purpose-built tank. It's about 6 feet wide and 21 feet long.
And what's the project that we're actually looking at here in the tank today?
Sure. We're conserving some very large timbers from Fort Edward, New York, the actual fort that was located in what is now the town of Fort Edward.
And what period is that fort again?
The fort was principally built during the French and Indian War, so 1750s.
And then how does it end up here, and what's going to happen to it?
Sure. These were found basically sticking out of the riverbank and into the water. So they were saturated for their entire time on site, which is why they needed this special level of treatment. Waterlogged wood in particular is very fragile when it's removed from that water environment.
When it starts to dry out, once you get it on land, it can literally turn to dust.
Absolutely. Splits, cracks, warps, does all kinds of very strange things as it dries. So the process here was, first of all, to try to keep it as wet as possible in transit and in storage. We placed it into this tank that was filled with water, and we slowly started to add a chemical called polyethylene glycol into this bath.
It's the same thing that goes into a radiator in a car.
It's very similar, yes, and it's used in, the stuff we use is actually food-grade PEG. It's very safe to work with, and it's actually in a lot of food and cosmetic products. And over time, we just slowly increase the amount of PEG that's in the solution. As it penetrates into the wood, we can add a little bit more, and more PEG gets carried in.
So over time, the water's displaced with this solution, and that stabilizes the wood.
Yeah, the PEG is actually filling in many of the little spaces and the wood cells themselves within the wood and supporting the structure of the wood internally so that when it does dry, it doesn't shrink and crack like it would if it wasn't chemically treated.
And how long does that process take on something as large as the timbers from Fort Edward?
We're approaching the 3-year mark on this project, and you can see we're in the final phases. We're starting to dehydrate the wood and letting that PEG really support from the inside, but it is a very long-term process.
And what's the last step here? We're going to cover it back up and hook it up to humidifiers.
I'm going to put a dehumidifier here that's going to help to suck out the remaining moisture and give us some nice, hard, stable wood, and then it's going to be ready to go into a display at the Rogers Island Historic Site in Fort Edward.
Archaeologists also work underwater, and I asked Adam Kane to tell me about a massive 10-year project at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum.
This cannon is the end product from a project called the Valcour Bay Research Project. And it was a 10-year archaeological study at that Revolutionary War battlefield site to try and both learn about the archaeology of the battlefield, how the events unfolded to really help illustrate the history that we know about that battle. And then really importantly, in fact, I would argue even more important than the archaeology, is we wanted to address what is the main threat to that battlefield. And that is the removal of artifacts by divers there wanting to touch a true piece of history, because the history is there. But what we wanted to do was provide an archaeological outlet, a permitted project, scientific methodology that avocational archaeologists could
bring them into the process.
Bring them in. These folks are the best stewards of the sites. And so we had the opportunity over 10 years, we did this project for 10 years, for a couple weeks every summer, to bring in a whole corps of divers, go out there, teach them these methods, and survey the battlefield. And at the end of those 10 years, on the American line at the Battle of Valcour Island site, we had surveyed about the equivalent of 8 football fields worth of bottom, and doing that with metal detectors. So we put in transects, kind of like you do in land archaeology, on the bottom, and ran a metal detector on every single transect to get 100% coverage of the bottom, finding where every metallic artifact was. So surveying along, and then mapping where they were precisely within the grid system that we created, mapping where everything is, and then leaving everything in place, in situ preservation of those artifacts until we had a look at everything that was out there. And then once we had an understanding of the way the site laid out, we did some selective artifact recovery permitted by the state of New York and the Navy for things like the pieces of this cannon and the carriage and some other smaller artifacts.
Unlike treasure hunters, museums preserve the objects they recover so that all of us can learn from and enjoy them. Archaeologists are always looking for ways to use the latest scientific discoveries and equipment to help them understand the past. Adam invited me to join his team from the museum on an expedition using some exciting new science to map shipwrecks on the lake bed.
What about the kind of thing we're doing today where we're not really disturbing the wreck at all? We're mapping it, but in terms of, if we go down and touch it and move things around and excavate around it, that's going to be an invasive process. This seems pretty non-invasive. Yeah. Can you talk me through how that works?
Well, there's certainly a place for that kind of invasive archaeology, but the best first place to start is to not damage.
Just don't touch it at all.
Just don't touch that archaeological site. It's been there for however long it's going to be there, and if you can leave it the same way as it started before your project, that's a great credit, and it does it provides archaeologists of the future with that same site to go and look at. So what we're doing here is we're using sound to document a wreck. It's a scanning 3D sonar. It takes really only those acoustic pictures of the wreck, and it leaves it exactly the way it was when we started.
So when we're finished, we're going to have a complete map and a 3D image of the wreck and the site, and as you finish the whole area, those can all be stitched together, that's exactly and you'll have a complete three-dimensional map of the lake bed without ever having to actually disturb anything.
That's exactly right.
Back at the museum, I went over the results of the scans with Chris.
So Chris, we were out on the boats the other day doing some mapping of the canal boats, and we've got some of the preliminary scans back. Can you walk me through what those are looking like?
So here we can see the entire scan area. It's got quite a range. But what we're looking at specifically is this target right in here, which is the canal boat we were looking at. So we'll zoom right in. Pivot this around a little bit. You can see this black circle here is actually where the scanning unit, the sonar unit, was set on the bottom. Right. And here is the bow of the canal boat we're looking at. This is the side of the vessel, and it curves around here to the bow. This is the stem, or the central timber in the bow. And the planking has all fallen off of this. So what we're seeing are the individual ribs or
the structural
frames.
Elements of the boat.
That's right. We're seeing the interior structure, which from an archaeological point of view is really the interesting part anyway. So we can also see in this image these two bright lines coming down here and here are two of the reference points that we put in.
Okay, right, so you've got that right there at an angle, and you've got that one there at an angle.
And those are going to be used to help stitch all these individual images together into one composite image.
So Chris, how many times have you guys used this technology to document shipwrecks?
This is actually only the second time that we've been able to employ this technology on Lake Champlain. We did it in 2012 on the Sloop Island Canal Boat, and then we did this work this year on the South Bay wreck that you guys witnessed. Yeah, so only twice. We hope to use it again in the future, though, for sure.
So Chris, as recently as 5 years ago, would this kind of technology been available to archaeologists?
I think this technology was just emerging as something that archaeologists might employ. We first became aware of its archaeological potential when it was used on a small steamboat wreck up in Alaska. And we decided it would be a great idea to employ this piece of technology here in Lake Champlain.
In addition to technology like sonar and ground-penetrating radar, archaeologists also rely on experiments to fill in the gaps in what we know. By using experimental techniques, archaeologists have begun to understand more about how the first Native American ancestors made tools and hunted. I headed out to southwest Missouri to meet with Larry Kinsella, an archaeologist who was the 1982 World Atlatl champion. An atlatl is an ancient weapon comprised of a spear and throwing stick.
Larry, is it like throwing a baseball?
No, not really. What it's actually the opposite of throwing a baseball. A baseball you want to throw with a lot of power at the beginning. With this, you want to have your power at the end. So when it gets to about 2 o'clock, give it a little push. And really what you're doing is pushing it.
Flick, yeah.
Right, and that's what allows it to go on. So forget, get it hooked on, just make sure that that little spur is caught. And don't have to put a whole lot of effort. I actually went right over it that time. So yeah, just a little flip at the end with a good follow through, and that's all you need.
Using experience gained from years of working with the atlatl, Larry became aware of how the weapon performed during use and how his body responded to the stress of using it.
hunting. I don't hunt white-tailed deer in my area because it's illegal, but I do go out and mushroom hunt, and I observe, and I hold a stick when I'm doing that. And what I noticed was that it takes about 2 minutes for a white-tailed deer to look the other way if you've got an ambush set up.
So kind of that classic experimental archaeology scenario.
And so what I did is, if I'd see the deer first, you have to see him first, then I'd grab a stick and hold it. Now, if I hold my regular lattle without a banner stone on it, then what I would do is hook it on, and I'd hold it like this. And I was waiting for the deer to look away. Well, the deer, they're trying to test you. They want to see what you're doing, so they'll snark, try to get you to move. Sometimes they stamp their foot. Sometimes they'll do both. And then after about a minute or so, they'll look back down, and then they look back up trying to fool you. And if you're fooled, you can't get your shot. The problem is you can't be in this position. You have to be in this position, because if you raise when the deer's going to see that out of the corner of their eye. So once you're positioned like this, you're shot. There's really nothing you can do other than outweight the deer. And that's the problem. You cannot hold this for 2 minutes without having muscle strain to where it affects your throw. So when you add a banner stone to it, now you are perfectly balanced.
And you were telling me how they measured that on you as well.
Right. I needed to prove this for my paper, and so I went to Washington University, and Dr. Kelly at Cahokia Mounds rigged me up with Dr. Ponzer at WashU, and they have a electromyograph that studies the electrical impulses in your muscles. They're using it a lot for veterans that come back and need physical therapy to find out which muscle needs therapy. So what he said, well, why don't we try this with that? And so what we did is I held it for 2 minutes without the banner stone, and then 2 minutes with the banner stone, because that's the amount of time it takes a deer to look away, a doe anyway. And we found out that when we read the readout, that this muscle has 62% less stress, this one's 72% less stress, this one 46%, but the bicep is only 1%, but you don't use the bicep till you throw. So hopefully the next experiment we'll be throwing with a slow motion camera, and then we can see when these spikes come where they are and compared to that slow motion camera to see what muscles are affected at what point. I'm hoping it'll work. We don't know. That's what experiments are for.
Is that the right grip? I mean, around like that with the finger, or how do I hold it?
What you want to do is get your fingers to pinch the spear between them.
Like
right.
that.
And you don't have to pinch it very hard, just enough to hold the dart there.
All right. Why is this thing so hard to throw?
Well,
something.
This takes at least 6 weeks of practice before you go out to a trial, at least. Look at that. Good throw. All right.
Larry and his colleague Bo Brown have spent decades trying to understand how the ancestors made and used stone tools.
When you want to find out what a point's for, put a handle on it. If you want to find out why it's thin on the base, why those flakes are there, put a handle on it. You'll find out that the handle is the hard piece to make. This is a half hour to an hour. This is 6 or 8 hours with steel tools and 12 or 14 hours with stone tools.
Mm-hmm. All right, guys, so what are some of the basic tools we're going to need to put together a stone tool?
So a rock is one of the best ones. And Bo's got a little harder one.
Yeah, this is limestone. It's again out of a creek bottom out here, and it's for a little bit larger stuff. If you're working with trying to get a bigger, the bigger flake is called a spall, and that's if you're going to make like a spear or a large knife blade, you want to go scale up to everything, and if you can find rock big enough to do it, and in effect, what you're doing is knocking a shock wave through the stone. You're trying to identify a face where you can knock a big flake out of it like that you can use. You want something with a lot of surface area and not too thick so you can make a nice blade out of it.
And there we are.
And that would be that's called a spall. And that's what you would work down into a large spear point or a large knife blade or something like that. And
yeah, that edge is
it is usable as
sharp.
a tool right there. In fact, it doesn't get any sharper than that.
Cutting through leather like that, just like it was paper.
My knife wouldn't do that.
No.
These are used with pressure flaking. So you make the preform, get everything ready, and then you come back and you pressure flake and you put that very fine serrated edge.
And pressure flake is chipping with an antler bone.
Pressing with an antler, and in this case antler, later it would be copper.
Mm-hmm.
So, but what that does is it gives you that really great sharp edge. You don't need that necessarily with mastodons. You have to have a more rounded tip, and you have to get the cut started quicker, and so the big flakes actually lend that self to penetration, but that leads itself to butchering.
Science, technology, engineering, and math are some of the most important tools in our archaeological toolkit. And using these tools, we're beginning to understand the stories told by the objects embedded in the ground beneath our feet. Join us next time as we dig into the archaeological history of the War of 1812. Check out the America from the Ground Up website for crew blogs, behind-the-scenes photographs, and more.
America, from the Ground Up, is made possible in part by a grant from the Michigan Humanities Council, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Central Michigan University College of Humanities, Social, and Behavioral Sciences. The Kirby Foundation, a family foundation supporting education. And B.K. Bradshaw, author of the Crystal Brave series of young adult novels, encouraging young people to explore archaeology.